I buried my husband alone, and that was the moment I stopped being their bank. Only one person showed up to my husband's funeral. Me. Not our son, not our daughter, not even one grandchild, just me, sitting in the front row while rows of empty chairs stared back at me like silent witnesses. The chapel felt too large for one grieving body. Every cough echoed. Every shuffle of paper sounded amplified. The air itself seemed to pause, as if it, too, was waiting for footsteps that never came. The funeral director leaned in gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like to wait a little longer?" I shook my head. "No," I said. He always hated being kept waiting. It was such a small sentence, but it carried decades inside it. A lifetime of knowing the way he checked his watch when someone ran late, the way he'd stand by the door 5 minutes before we were meant to leave, the way he valued punctuality as a form of respect. In that moment, honoring that simple quirk felt like the last act of love I could give him. So, we didn't wait. The service began on time, just as he would have wanted. And as the words were spoken and the music played to a room mostly filled with silence, something shifted inside me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like a door closing softly somewhere deep in my chest. This wasn't just about losing my husband. It was about realizing who actually shows up when it matters. Grief has a way of stripping life down to its bones. There are no decorations in grief. No pretense, no social performance. When someone dies, what remains is raw truth. And the truth that morning was simple and undeniable. When it came time to stand in the hardest moment of my life, I stood alone. I had imagined that day differently. I had pictured my children sitting beside me, their shoulders brushing mine. I had imagined a grandchild reaching for my hand. I had imagined shared tears, shared stories, shared silence. I had imagined family. Instead, there were empty chairs. Empty chairs have a presence of their own. They say what people do not. They hold the shape of absence. They make you confront questions you didn't want to ask. Where were they? Why didn't they come? Did he matter so little to them? Did I? But as the service continued, something else began to settle in. A harder truth, yes, but also a clearer one. Showing up is a choice. Love isn't measured in holiday cards or occasional phone calls. It isn't measured in polite conversations or social media posts. Love, real love, reveals itself in presence, in inconvenience, in uncomfortable rooms filled with grief, in sitting beside someone when there are no easy words to offer. And that morning, only one person chose to be present. Me. I realized then that I had spent years believing that blood automatically meant loyalty, that family automatically meant solidarity, that shared history guaranteed shared responsibility. But life doesn't work that way. Relationships require tending. Showing up requires intention. And sometimes the people you would rearrange the world for won't rearrange their schedule for you. That realization hurt. It still does. But beneath the hurt, there was something else forming. Something steadier than anger and quieter than heartbreak. There was clarity. I showed up for him when he was sick. I showed up for him through hospital visits and medication schedules. I showed up through the long nights and the difficult days. I showed up at the end. And I showed up at his funeral. No one can take that from me. In that quiet chapel, surrounded by absence, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Sometimes strength doesn't look like a crowd. Sometimes it looks like one person sitting in the front row, refusing to let love go unrecognized. The empty chairs stopped accusing me and started teaching me. They taught me that expectations can quietly break your heart. They taught me that clarity can be born from disappointment. They taught me that presence is precious precisely because it is rare. I walked into that chapel, a wife who had just lost her husband. I walked out a woman who understood something deeper about the nature of relationships. It wasn't bitterness that settled in me. It was awareness, a recalibration, a quiet decision that moving forward I would invest my energy where it is returned, that I would cherish the people who show up without being asked, that I would no longer confuse obligation with devotion. Losing him was the greatest pain, but sitting alone among those empty chairs revealed another kind of truth, one that may ultimately shape the rest of my life. When it matters most, some people disappear, and some people remain. That day, I remained. I honored him. I kept his memory on time. I bore witness to his life. And in the stillness of that nearly empty room, I realized that sometimes love is not measured by how many people fill the chairs. Sometimes it is measured by the one person who refuses to leave it empty. Harold was a disciplined man. Alarm at 6:30, coffee at 7. Bills paid early, shoes lined up straight by the door. He believed that how you did the small things said something about how you would do the big ones. He worked 43 years straight, rarely complained, never cut corners. If he gave his word, it was as good as signed paper. If he started a job, he finished it. There was a steadiness to him that made the world feel less chaotic. Everything he did was for our children. College tuition? Covered. Down payment for our son's house? We wired it without a second thought. Our daughter's temporary business loan that somehow stretched into years? That was us too. If they needed help, we were there. No hesitation. Harold used to say, "They won't have to struggle the way we did." And he meant it. He remembered the tiny apartment with the flickering heater, the nights he worked overtime while I clipped coupons at the kitchen table, the second-hand furniture, the careful budgeting down to the penny. He wanted our children to start further ahead than we ever did. And they did. Birthdays were generous, holidays were abundant, emergencies were handled swiftly. If a car broke down, we paid for repairs. If a roof leaked, we wrote the check. If a dream needed funding, we believed in it. Harold never kept score out loud, but I know he kept it quietly in his heart, not in resentment, but in pride. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in something bigger than himself. That was the kind of man he was, disciplined, responsible, devoted, which is why the empty chairs at his funeral felt so impossibly loud. As I sat there in the front row, I couldn't help but think about the years he woke up at 6:30 sharp, even on mornings when he was bone-tired, about the Saturdays he spent fixing things around our children's homes instead of resting, about the vacations we postponed because tuition bills came first. He never once said, "What about us?" When our son called needing help with the down payment, Harold didn't hesitate. "We'll make it work," he said, already calculating numbers in his head. When our daughter's business struggled month after month, he reassured her, "These things take time." Even when I worried we were stretching ourselves thin, he would squeeze my hand and say, "It's for them." And it was, always for them. He believed that love was provision, that showing up meant solving the problem, that being a good father meant carrying weight so his children wouldn't have to. He carried it willingly. So when the chapel doors remained closed that morning, no rushed footsteps, no whispered apologies, no grandchildren fidgeting in dress clothes, it didn't just feel like absence. It felt like a question hanging in the air. What does showing up really mean? Harold showed up in every practical way imaginable. He showed up with checks and wire transfers, with late-night advice calls, with quiet bailouts no one else knew about. He showed up with consistency, but somewhere along the way, perhaps we confused support with connection. We gave and gave, believing that generosity naturally built closeness. We assumed that sacrifice would be remembered not as obligation, but as love. And maybe it was remembered. Maybe in their own way they were grieving privately. People handle death differently, I've been told. Some avoid it because it feels too heavy. Some stay away because they don't know how to face it. But sitting alone in that front pew, it was hard not to measure. 43 years of discipline. Decades of provision. a lifetime of reliability. And yet, in the one moment where presence required nothing but time, just sitting in a chair, just bearing witness, no one came. Harold would have noticed that. Not with anger. He wasn't a dramatic man. But he understood duty. He understood respect. He understood that certain moments are not optional. Still, I can almost hear what he would say if he were beside me. "Don't make it bigger than it is," he'd murmur. "People have their reasons." That was his way. Practical. Controlled. Emotions filed neatly, like the bills he paid before they were due. But I am not as disciplined as Harold. I felt the sting. I felt the imbalance between what was given and what was returned. I felt the quiet ache of realizing that love expressed through sacrifice does not guarantee love expressed through presence. And yet, even in that ache, I know this: Harold did not give so that he would be repaid. He gave because that was who he was. Disciplined, devoted, steady. He lined up his shoes every night so mornings would be easier. He paid bills early so we would never feel panic. He worked for 43 years so his children would have options. He believed that responsibility was a form of love. That morning, I showed up the way he taught me to. On time, composed, present. I didn't wait, because he hated being kept waiting. I sat in that front row not just as his wife, but as the only person who fully understood the quiet, structured life he built, brick by brick. The only one who saw the overtime hours and the silent worries. The only one who knew how much of himself he poured into making sure everyone else was secure. The empty chairs said one thing, but my presence said another. He was not alone. Not in life. Not in death. Because even if no one else understood the weight of what he carried, I did. And I was there. The morning of the funeral, our son sent a text. "Sorry, Mom. Big meeting. Rain check?" Rain check. For a funeral. I read it twice, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe there was more coming. Maybe a second message would follow. "I'll try to come after. I'll call. I'm so sorry." But the screen stayed still in my hand. A rain check is for dinner, for coffee, for a movie you can reschedule, not for burying your father. Our daughter didn't text at all. Instead, sometime mid-morning, my phone lit up with her name attached to a photo. She was smiling, head tilted slightly, holding a cocktail in a glass that caught the light. The caption read something cheerful about living my best life with a small sparkle emoji at the end. I stared at that picture longer than I should have. I searched her face for something. Redness around the eyes, a forced smile. Any small crack that might suggest she was holding herself together the only way she knew how. But she looked radiant, effortless, untouched. Then I set my phone down. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just felt something inside me go quiet. Not angry, not dramatic. Just finished. It wasn't a sudden explosion of betrayal. It wasn't a scene from a movie where the grieving widow shatters a glass against the wall. It was quieter than that. More final. It felt like the last thread snapping. I went to the funeral anyway. Sat in the front row. Declined the offer to wait. Honored Harold the way he would have wanted, on time, without fuss. But that morning, as the service began, I understood something that had been forming for years without my fully noticing. I had been showing up for everyone else for decades. When the kids were sick, I stayed up through the night. When they forgot projects, I drove them to school. When they needed money, we found it. When they needed reassurance, I gave it. Birthdays planned, holidays hosted, problems solved, feelings soothed. Even as adults, they called when something broke, financially or emotionally. And I answered. Always. I told myself that was motherhood, that was family, that was love. And maybe it was, but love, I was beginning to realize, should not flow in only one direction. When I came home from the cemetery, the house felt heavy. Not just quiet, heavy. as if the walls themselves understood something had ended. Harold's recliner still faced the blank television. His glasses rested neatly on the side table, folded carefully the way he always left them. His slippers were lined up perfectly beside the chair, toes pointing outward, ready for feet that would never slide into them again. For a brief, foolish second, I had the strange sensation that he might walk back in, that this had all been some misunderstanding, that he would clear his throat, glance at the clock, and ask what was for dinner. But he wasn't coming back. The permanence of that settled over me like a weight, and in that stillness, another truth rose to the surface, one I had avoided for a long time. I had built my life around showing up. For my husband. For my children. For my grandchildren. I showed up even when I was tired. Even when I felt unappreciated. Even when the effort wasn't returned. I told myself that consistency mattered more than acknowledgement. But standing in that quiet living room, staring at Harold's empty chair, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Who shows up for me? The answer echoed through the house. No one had sat beside me that morning. No one had taken my hand. No one had chosen to rearrange their schedule for the man who rearranged his entire life for them. And I realized something uncomfortable but liberating at the same time. I didn't have to keep doing this. I didn't have to keep overextending. I didn't have to keep rescuing. I didn't have to keep pretending that scraps of attention were enough. The quiet inside me wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge forming. It was clarity. For years, I believed that if I just loved hard enough, gave generously enough, remained steady enough, everything would circle back. That devotion would inspire devotion. That sacrifice would be mirrored. But people get used to what is always there. They assume it will continue. They schedule meetings. They post smiling photos. They take rain checks. Because somewhere along the way, they stopped believing you might ever stop showing up. For my husband. For my children. For my grandchildren. I showed up even when I was tired. Even when I felt unappreciated. Even when the effort wasn't returned. I told myself that consistency mattered more than acknowledgement. But standing in that quiet living room, staring at Harold's empty chair, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Who shows up for me? The answer echoed through the house. No one had sat beside me that morning. No one had taken my hand. No one had chosen to rearrange their schedule for the man who rearranged his entire life for them. And I realized something uncomfortable, but liberating at the same time. I didn't have to keep doing this. I didn't have to keep overextending. I didn't have to keep rescuing. I didn't have to keep pretending that scraps of attention were enough. The quiet inside me wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge forming. It was clarity. For years, I believed that if I just loved hard enough, gave generously enough, remained steady enough, everything would circle back. That devotion would inspire devotion. That sacrifice would be mirrored. But people get used to what is always there. They assume it will continue. They schedule meetings. They post smiling photos. They take rain checks. Because somewhere along the way, they stopped believing you might ever stop showing up. I walked through the house slowly that afternoon. I picked up Harold's glasses and held them for a moment before setting them back down exactly where they had been. I ran my hand along the back of his recliner. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and let the quiet settle without trying to fix it. For the first time in decades, there was no one to cook for, no one to coordinate with, no one to anticipate. The space was terrifying and strangely peaceful. Maybe it was time to redirect the energy I had poured outward for so long. Maybe it was time to show up for myself with the same consistency I had offered everyone else. Not in a dramatic announcement-making way, just quietly, the way something inside me had gone quiet that morning. Finished doesn't always mean broken. Sometimes it means complete. A chapter closed, a role fulfilled, a long season of giving reaching its natural end. I loved my husband, I will always love my children, but I am no longer willing to be the only one sitting in the front row. And for the first time in my life, I am beginning to understand that stepping back is not cruelty. It is self-respect. I walked into his office and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there. The room was exactly as Harold had kept it, orderly, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its neatness. The desk surface was clear except for a leather blotter and a single pen placed parallel to its edge. The bookshelf behind him held binders arranged by height. Even in death, nothing was out of place. I moved to the desk and knelt down, opening the bottom drawer on the left. There it was. The folder labeled Estate Planning. Of course it was labeled. Of course it was easy to find. Harold believed in preparation the way some people believe in luck. You didn't hope for things to work out, you made sure they did. We had prepared everything years ago. Organized. Fair. Equal. The house split evenly. The savings split evenly. The cabin split evenly. We had sat at this very desk with our attorney and nodded at the word equal as if it were a moral achievement. Equal meant no favoritism, no arguments, no resentment after we were gone. Equal sounded good on paper, but sitting there alone, the folder open across my lap, it suddenly didn't feel right. If everything was equal, why had the responsibility never been? Why had Harold been the one calculating tuition payments late at night? Why had we adjusted our retirement plans to cover temporary gaps that somehow lasted years? Why had we wired money within hours while requests for simple presents went unanswered? Equal division assumes equal investment, and that wasn't our story. The next morning, I called our attorney. He offered his condolences again before asking what I needed. "I need changes," I said. There was a pause. Papers shifting faintly on his end. "What kind of changes?" I didn't circle the words. I didn't soften them. "I want my children removed from my will." Silence. Not shocked, just careful. "Are you certain you'd like to make that decision so soon?" He asked gently. "This is a significant change." I kept my voice steady. "I buried my husband alone." Another pause. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." It wasn't anger speaking. It wasn't fresh grief clouding judgment. If anything, grief had stripped everything unnecessary away. What remained was clarity. Clarity doesn't feel chaotic. It feels calm. We went through everything line by line, assets reassigned, accounts redirected, beneficiary forms updated, legal language tightened. He explained contest clauses. We discussed enforceability. I asked about preventing manipulation or coercion later. I did not want loopholes. I did not want emotional pressure unraveling careful planning. When he asked where I wanted the estate to go, I didn't hesitate. "To Ethan," I said. "My grandson. The one who checks in without being prompted. The one who notices when the porch railing is loose and fixes it without a speech. The one who sat beside his grandfather in the hospital and didn't look at his phone. The one who shows up. I want a structured trust," I continued. "Protected. Controlled. Locked down." We discussed terms in detail, age milestones, staggered distributions, oversight mechanisms, safeguards. "No early access," I said. "No outside interference. If anyone thought they could pressure him later, convince him to share, guilt him into redistributing, corner him during holidays, they were out of luck. This wasn't about punishing my children. It was about aligning legacy with values. Harold believed in responsibility, in earned trust, in quiet consistency. It no longer felt honest to divide everything evenly, as if effort and absence carried the same weight. That night, after dinner dishes sat untouched in the sink, I found myself pulling out an old storage box of bank statements. I hadn't meant to look, but once I started, I couldn't stop. Transfer after transfer. Highlighted notes in Harold's handwriting: car repair, mortgage assist, inventory purchase, emergency tuition gap. The amounts weren't small. At the time, each had felt justified, necessary. Just this once. We'll pay you back. Some repayments came in modest installments, most dissolved quietly into history. As the stack grew beside me, a realization settled in. Over the years, we hadn't just supported our children, we had sustained them. We had absorbed the impact of poor planning, softened consequences, extended timelines, filled deficits. We had been the constant correction to every miscalculation, and we did it willingly, lovingly. But love without boundaries slowly turns into expectation, and expectation, left unchecked, becomes entitlement. When their father needed them for half an hour at a graveside, they were suddenly too busy. A meeting, a cocktail, a caption about living a best life. That realization stung more than the funeral itself. The funeral was about loss. This was about imbalance. I wasn't tallying dollars in search of repayment. I wasn't rewriting the will out of spite. If I had been acting out of anger, I would have felt heat. I would have felt chaos. Instead, I felt composed. For decades, I believed fairness meant equal distribution. Now I understand something different. Fairness is not sameness. Fairness is alignment. Harold built his life on discipline, effort, and showing up. His legacy should reflect those values, not contradict them. Ethan will never know the full extent of what changed, at least not now. He hasn't earned it through flattery or performance. He's earned it through presence, through consistency, through quiet respect. I stacked the bank records back into their box and slid it away. The house was silent, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt resolved. I had buried my husband alone, but I would not bury his values with him. Clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't seek applause. It signs paperwork. And then it rests. Ethan found out about the funeral from a neighbor, not from his parents. He showed up at my door the following afternoon, breathless, hair uncombed, eyes wide with something between confusion and hurt. He didn't even knock properly, just tapped once and stepped back like he wasn't sure what he was walking into. "Grandma," he said when I opened the door, "why didn't anyone tell me?" There was no accusation in his voice, just shock. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the living room, looking at Harold's empty recliner, as if expecting his grandfather to rise up and explain the misunderstanding himself. "I thought you knew," I said gently. "I assumed your parents told you." His jaw tightened. "They didn't." That told me more than anything else. When I explained what I had done, about the will, about the trust, about the changes, he looked stunned. Not excited. Not triumphant. "This is too much," he said quietly. I shook my head. "It's not too much. It's intentional." He didn't ask about amounts. He didn't ask about timelines. He didn't start calculating what it meant for him. He just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. And that told me I had made the right decision. The next day, my daughter arrived unannounced. She didn't knock softly like Ethan had. She knocked sharply, repeatedly, like she was trying to break through more than just a door. When I opened it, she walked past me without waiting to be invited in. "I heard what you did," she said, her voice already rising. "Are you serious? This is revenge." I closed the door and faced her. "It isn't revenge," I said calmly. "It's consequences." She tried guilt first. "How could you do this to your own children?" Then anger. "You're punishing us because we couldn't make one day work?" Then tears. "After everything we've done for you," that one made me pause. I repeated her words slowly, letting them settle between us. "After everything you've done for me." The silence stretched. She had no list to offer, no receipts to pull out, no quiet decades of sacrifice to reference. She left angry. I remained steady. That was new for me. My son came the following morning with a different strategy. He didn't raise his voice. He wore his composure like a suit. "Mom, this isn't fair," he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "You're making an emotional decision." "What wasn't fair," I replied, "was your father leaving this world without his children beside him." He shifted in his chair. "You're dividing the family over money." I looked at him carefully. "The family divided itself," I said. "Money just exposed it." He warned me about resentment, about long-term consequences, about legal challenges that could get messy. I listened. And then I told him, gently but firmly, everything is airtight. He left quieter than he arrived. At the bank, as I finalized the transfers and updated beneficiary designations, the branch manager asked me in a polite, rehearsed tone, "Are you comfortable making this decision right now?" Sometimes after a loss, emotions can influence financial choices. I smiled. "I'm not acting emotionally," I said. "I'm acting consciously. Anger is loud, clarity is quiet, and I had never felt quieter." After that, the phone calls slowed. The random just checking in messages stopped. No more casual drop-bys. No more updates about minor inconveniences that somehow required my input or my funds. It's funny how quickly communication dries up when the ATM closes. But I didn't feel bitter. I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis call. I wasn't mentally calculating whether we could make it work one more time. I wasn't bracing myself for another emergency that wasn't really an emergency. I wasn't budgeting for someone else's instability. I was just living my own life. A few mornings later, I took a walk in the park simply because I wanted to. No errands attached. No one expecting anything from me, no timeline but my own. The air felt crisp against my face. The sky seemed wider somehow, as if space had opened up above me. I found a bench beneath an old elm tree and sat there, listening to the wind move through its branches. I thought about Harold. He believed in responsibility, and sometimes responsibility doesn't mean giving more. Sometimes it means drawing a line and saying, "That's enough." That evening, I reread a letter he once wrote me years ago, tucked inside a book on our shelf. In it, he had written, "Promise me you won't disappear." For a long time, I thought disappearing meant isolation, becoming invisible, growing old alone. Now I understand it differently. Disappearing is shrinking yourself to keep other people comfortable. It's silencing your boundaries so no one has to adjust. It's financing absence so you can pretend it doesn't hurt. I'm not shrinking anymore. I didn't punish my children. I simply stopped financing their absence. If they ever come back, not for money, not for leverage, not for another bailout, but for a real relationship, my door will be open. But my accounts are closed. Because love isn't a subscription service. And after decades of automatic renewals, I finally canceled mine.